Thanks a lot. So maybe first, let me introduce myself a little bit beyond that. So I'm from Munich. That's true, but I've been working actually for the last 2 years, most of the time actually in Detroit area. So I know the US auto market also a little bit. Yeah, and I've been over the last couple of months and years working very often in the field of alternative powertrains. So for Europe, we helped to design basically the coalition for hydrogen that was very active, for example, in 2010, 2011. Where all the OEMs came together to kind of build a business plan for hydrogen rollout infrastructure in both fuel cell vehicles in Europe. After that, I've been working for battery manufacturers, both in Korea and also in Germany. Very recently, I'm helping also a international OEM on the launch of an electric commercial vehicle. Yeah, and I'm happy to share a little bit of the facts on e-mobility, overarchingly, but also implications for the value chain, and happy to invite you to raise questions either during the presentation or we can do it afterwards, either in this plenary or also personally. Okay? Very good. So, a couple of points that I wanted to raise today. Wanted to talk a little bit why we think there's a disruption coming in the automotive industry. Then looking at the disruption of e-mobility and the market outlook. What are the implications for the value chain, and what are some new business models actually evolving around e-mobility? So I would like to touch these 4 points in my presentation today. First of all, disruption. I think this is an executive survey that we did. 88% OEMs or supplier agree that 88% actually OEMs or supplier will disappear until 2030 due to disruption in the industry. 80% think that some of those OEMs or suppliers will disappear. 75% say yes, that new tech players actually will gain a significant share in the automotive value pool over the next couple of years. And as our former executive chairman of Ford said, the pace of change is accelerating. We now have disruption coming from every angle, from potential ways we fuel our vehicles to the ownership model. So it's a really ecosystem disruption. And our CEO from our Stuttgart-based Mercedes OEM said that we will soon witness the reinvention of the automobile. If we look a little bit, what are the underlying forces driving this disruption? It's actually quite interesting to look at what a car today actually does. So normally, a typical car in America spends 96% of its time being parked. It's 0.5% sitting in congestion, almost a percent looking for a parking lot, depends of course for the city, and then actually only 2.5% driving. If you look at the energy efficiency, you can actually see from a classical combustion time, most of the energy actually never reaches the wheels. So 86% is either engine losses, heat dissipation, or idling of the car when it's standing. And then you have all the mechanical losses, transmission, auxiliary power, aerodynamics, and then only a very, very small percentage actually reaches the wheel. So there's a lot kind of to gain to improve efficiency. And then last but not least, also going into the direction of autonomous, if you look at accidents, actually, more than 95% of fatal accidents are actually caused by human error. So if you look at the automotive industry from this angle, you see there's actually a lot to improve. And I think that's also what we are witnessing the early days now. Just a quick parallel. I don't want to draw this parallel too explicitly because I think there are some similarities, but certainly not too many. But if we look at the cell phone industry 17 years ago, what were on the left side basically the top 15 cell phone players, and in blue the new that were not in the top 15 17 years ago. You can see basically the whole board was disrupted and new players appeared here in the list. If you look at the automotive world, we see here 2 Chinese players actually appearing in the top 15 that haven't been there 15 years ago. So I don't want to say that this picture may change, but with all the ecosystem changes coming across, new value pools being created, definitely we will see very new players appearing on the right-hand side in the next couple of years. So when we talk about disruption, we always look at from 4 angles, 4 trends, 4 megatrends, which we call also CASE, so connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. And I think it's always important to look at these trends together, not an individual mindset, because this will basically help create new business models, will help create new revenue pools if you combine those elements of these different megatrends. I'll talk a little bit more about the interconnectivity of those trends at the end of the speech, but now for the time being, let's focus on electrification. So what are the 4 key drivers for electrification? You can say on the one side, depending on the country, is definitely macroeconomics, how car sales, how urbanization rates are developing in certain countries, number 1. Number 2, regulation and incentives, both on a state, national level, so miles per gallon or CO2 or NOx emissions, but also on a city and local level, so access regulations that we see more and more cities actually on a global level going to that direction and announcing emission-free cities in the next 15 years. Incentives, obviously on the same line, purchase incentives for electric vehicles that you have, or CO2 taxes on the other side, if that are likely to come. Technology drivers, I think 2 that I want to pick here. One is battery costs and of course infrastructure development, and last but not least looking at the customer. There's also some disruption and really a dynamic sense in the customer demand pattern, which we will see also in a second. So let's go through each of this driver very quickly. Macroeconomics. So if we look at the global rollout of cars going forward, you can see some people say there's shared economy, shared cars, so car sales overall will drop, but overall we think that until 2030 car sales will globally increase on a 2% per year basis. There will be some less private vehicles due to shared or more people moving into city, but at the same time more people moving into city requires also more mobility solutions. So urbanization is a driver actually for car sales, but also for clean environmental free CO2 friendly cars. And then also we of course have new shared vehicles, and with shared vehicles electric vehicles offer normally a big TCO advantage because they cover a larger mileage over a year compared to private vehicles. So overall, macroeconomics drivers really in favor for electric cars. On the regulation side, we see, and this is now just to make it comparable, what are the regulation limits in the different regions over the years to come, and there's really a corridor that you can see of the regulatory fleet targets in different regions for CO2, and OEMs have to be prepared for this. Maybe until 100 grams CO2 per kilometer, I would have to convert that into miles per gallon. It's approximately 30, 40, something around that, miles per gallon. Maybe a world of today works out. But then you come into the medium range here, where you have a mix of powertrains, and you have plug-in hybrids, hybrid cars, you have electric cars, but then eventually if regulation goes on, still CO2 based, you will have to go into an EV world, where targets below 50 grams CO2 per kilometers. You need a significant share of electric cars to reach these fleet targets. And this is also some part of the work that we do, for example, with OEMs. So nobody knows how regulation will be. You have to work in regulation corridors, and you see what is your powertrain portfolio that you want to set up for different scenarios of regulation, for example. And when are the critical paths in your development cycle when you have to decide, do you need more electric models or less, for example, for the years to come. On technology drivers, one very important one is obviously battery prices, and it's very interesting to look at the development of battery prices since 2010. They have dropped from $1,000 per kilowatt hour, so that's pack level normally, down to now on around $200 per kilowatt hour, depending on the battery size and Obviously, there are different announcements by each OEM, so depending on its individual economies of scale, these costs will vary from OEM or supplier to supplier. But this is the cost level. And if you look at past projections, they were always too conservative. So costs have come down more significantly, actually, than they were expected to come down. And at the same time, on the right-hand side, you see actually how electric vehicles picked up. So there's, if you want, so an indirect or direct correlation between the battery costs, which is a major cost driver, obviously, of the entire electric car. And if you look at similarities in the past, so where we had projections of cost, if you look at semiconductors, how costs have come down, and this is on a double logarithmic scale here, how semiconductor have come down in a cost. We're talking between 1980 and 2008, there's a factor of 100,000 in the cost. Displays, LCD displays from 1997 to 2009, we saw this. On photovoltaic, the costs have come down since the late 70s until 2009, factor 70. And lithium-ion batteries, so far, we're talking about a cost factor of 10 so far. And obviously, going forward, maybe the next lithium-ion battery generation will bring the cost a little bit further down, but the next jump will be post-lithium-based batteries that probably will achieve a bigger energy density and associated cost as well. All this translating into the total cost of ownership of an electric car, and here very simplified actually for the US market. When do we see that a CD segment car in the US average will have TCO, total cost of ownership, parity with a gasoline driven car? And you can see the two curves here. The dotted line is an electric car. We still see a little bit of increase over the next couple years of the cost. That's basically because, you will put a little bit more battery in it. Maybe the features get a little bit more, that the customer in the end gets a car that has the same convenience as a classical ICE, but from then onwards we see actually the cost decreasing, and one of the main drivers is battery costs coming down, economies of scale of the electric car manufacturing, etc. pp. On the same side, the cost for gasoline powertrains and cars will not decrease, they will rather increase. You have to put more and more technology into the engine to abate your CO2 emissions. So similar things that have been developed for the diesel engines now will be more relevant for gasoline engines, making them more expensive and so on and so on. So you reach TCO parities in the next couple of years, and probably that's also when we think that a tipping point in electric vehicle adoption will happen, which not only depends on that one, it depends on other drivers, also like the electric vehicle supply, how many models are in the market, etc. And it depends on the customer. Before I go to the next slide, because we did this customer research at the beginning of the year, we asked normally people how many of your car drivers currently own an electric car. And if I could ask you to raise the hands, who owns an electric car? Okay. So, and who of you, let's assume you're buying a car within the next 3 to 5 years, a new car. Who of you would consider actually then buying an electric or a plug-in electric car? Yeah, so that's at least half of the population, I would say. So, and this is similar what we actually found out also here in the US, looking at the purchase funnel from awareness to, are you aware of electric cars? That they are out? Are you familiar with the technology? Are you actually considering it? And we see that in the US 30% and in Germany 44% actually considering buying an electric car as the next vehicle. And I think there's still some reasons to overcome, some problems and some issues to overcome, that they will eventually purchase it. But I think there's some customer dynamics also, and customer willingness to purchase actually can be seen. Another thing which we found interesting is normally if we look at the electric car market in the US and also in Europe, it has been penetrated really from the premium segment. Obviously Tesla or some of the BMW i8 cars, so really top-notch premium cars. We think that the next wave of electric car owners will obviously be lower income, medium income brackets, and that's where basically the market will pick up. In China, this is already the case. In China, it's more a mass market, budget driven phenomena, electric cars, where actually the average income of a person that buys an electric vehicle is almost lower than the income of the person that buys a new gasoline-driven vehicle. So here also significant shift to be expected. If we look at we also try to cluster a little bit the customers for electric cars. So what we show here is on the x-axis the level of battery electric vehicle consideration. So how much do you consider actually buying it, and the household income. So we had kind of the first horizon, which were like the status and luxury seekers, the Tesla S-type type of buyer. Then we have the second horizon of electric cars, which will be obviously maybe Tesla 3, but also the mainstream cars, the GM, the 20 models that GM announced this week. So they come into that bucket. And then the third horizon, which will be essentially, yes, it will be a fully fledged, a lot of features, very expensive, so maybe not an individual buyer will afford all these cars, but this is really where new business models will be helpful to kind of bring those cars to the market, be it e-hailing, car sharing, etc., where those electric, let's say, third generation electric cars will come to the market. What we're also doing, we are on a quarterly basis, we are actually looking at how do the different markets and regions actually develop in favor for electric vehicles, which we call our electric vehicle index. And there's an industry EVI, so how favorable is the local industry, or how advanced is the local industry for electric vehicles? Is there support for the industry to produce it? So obviously here China would be very much on the right-hand side, so the government puts a lot of favor for the industry to promote a homegrown electric vehicle industry. And we have basically the market EVI, the market index, which is, okay, how actually acceptable or convenient is it for consumers to drive an electric car? Is there a good charging infrastructure available? Are there some benefits to purchase it, some subsidies, etc.? What's interesting on this analysis, normally it's very interesting to see the dynamics, how China has moved out over the last couple of years really down to this one. It's probably the first country that will be in the upper right corner of this diagram. And we have obviously countries like Norway who are very favorable, obviously from a market point of view, but local industry is not relevant. But you see, neither on a global perspective, China is on the way maybe to become the overall market and industry leader, and there's no single market that really drives it, e-mobility from an industry and from a, let's say, customer acceptance market perspective. How do we, double click one more time on China. So China definitely is very much growing. Everybody knows that in electric vehicles. If we look that compared to the US market has been stabilized over the last couple of years. 37% in growth from 117,000 electric vehicles per year to 160,000 electric vehicles per year last year. And as you can see, China is at least double the amount already. And also Europe has been flattening. So that's just to underline that. So all this together, what are the market dynamics that we can see? We saw customer, we saw also model availability over the next couple of years to increase. We saw the battery costs coming down, so TCO advantage around 2021 for the CD segment. What we can see when we model actually our electric vehicles with our proprietary market model, we see two scenarios. Either it goes a little bit smoother transition, or it goes a little bit more with an inflection starting in 2020 with a market penetration of purely electric cars from 16 to 29% in 2030, and around 10% for plug-in electric vehicles. And the dark blue ones that you can see are hybrid electric cars. So what are the key determining factors basically for this very sensitive market outlook? It's definitely the battery price. There's uncertainty. You can see for the left-hand side, we assumed $90 per kilowatt hour in 2030 on a pack level, which is very conservative. Whereas in a breakthrough case, we looked at $55 per kilowatt hour. We also looked at the basically what is the regulation targets in those years, between 50 to 70 miles per gallon. What we looked at, and also shared mobility is one important driver. So in the more aggressive portion, we calculate with 15% or 15% shared vehicle sales. So every new sales that goes into shared vehicles. So that's a little bit the outlook from the market point of view. But I think whoever you listen to, we're talking about 20-30% of electric cars in the next 10 years, which is a huge, considerable penetration in the market, and puts the OEMs, especially the incumbents, the existing OEMs, at a large pressure because they have to make the transition from the old powertrains to the new world. And this is obviously kind of a legacy that they have to overcome. Maybe quickly one outlook on commercial electric vehicles. As I mentioned before, similar on the market outlook, we did also the TCO modeling, and obviously total cost of ownership for commercial electric vehicles is really one of the key drivers, because all your customers are actually fleet operating customers. And if you look at that one, what will be really the key driving applications and markets? So we see basically in the light duty and medium duty trucks, these are trucks that cover urban last mile delivery, that cover maybe regional distribution, 100, 200 miles per day of distribution. This is kind of the sweet spot for commercial electric vehicle electrification, where they don't have to charge on the go from their hub to their distribution center, but can use actually the charging stations at the hub or at the distribution center, or at the spoke, if you want so. And this is where we see a high penetration also for that one, because you obviously have, the longer you make your range, the more you get your benefits from an operating point of view, because electricity running costs lower than the diesel prices, but at the same time the battery stack needs to be also more expensive. So there's kind of a sweet spot for range. All right, so I think many of you know this picture. I like to show it a lot. It shows just how fast change can come, and how fast technology can change basically human behavior, and also something that you observe on the streets. So that was New York City, Fifth Avenue in 1990, where you had lots of horses and one lonely car, and 13 years later you had no horses anymore on that street. So let's just think back 100 years, let's put the movie 100 years forward and see how 13 years from now could look like. Now talking a little bit about value chain implications. So something that I would like to highlight first is how different OEMs position themselves for the electric vehicle platform. So normally we can say your platform architecture, you have the choice, either you do a purpose-built EV platform, or you do a hybrid platform, basically, which satisfies the needs for a hybrid car, for an ICE combustion car, and also for an electric vehicle. And then you have on the x-axis, you have actually how deep you go into the value chain. And it's interesting to locate some of the industry players here. Let's start, for example, some of the startups. They would like to use a purpose-built EV platform, and they would like to outsource as much as possible of their EV components. So Geely, who's no longer a startup anymore, Next EV, Faraday Future, those are some of those players in that area. Then we come to, let's say, to some of the legacy players. Let's say Daimler, Mercedes, they do a purpose-built EV platform, but for the next generation EQ series. BMW has done so for the i3 and i8, so that was really a purpose-built EV carbon, and you don't have the middle console and everything. BYD does the same as well, and BYD is also the one of the companies that's mostly vertically integrated. You see from the left to the right, this is the company that's more integrated. And then you see a lot of these legacy players from today, still having kind of using hybrid platforms. BMW, by the way, for the next generation of their plug-ins and electric cars, they will go more to a hybrid architecture that can satisfy both purposes of hybrid cars and purely battery electric cars. So one thing to consider before how much is actually value contributed from the powertrain. You have the classical ICE world on the left-hand side, where basically the basic engine is the heart of the car, the transmission, control injection, auxiliaries, and exhaust. So you see an equal distribution of value generation of powertrain components in the ICE world. In the new world, the electric world, basically, it's really 70% or even more, depending on the range, is composed by the battery electric car, and that puts like the whole industry at a question mark. In a classical world where you had a, let's say, linear value chain with established tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, now all of a sudden 70, 80%, 90% of the powertrain comes from non-classical tier 1 suppliers, and this is both putting a lot of question marks to these current suppliers. Will they enter that world? And as well to the OEMs, how they work together with the LG Chems of the world. So it's a paradigm shift that we see here. Looking a little bit, often we are asked by suppliers and OEMs, what are the powertrain components that I actually should produce in-house and which ones should I outsource? And what we normally do is we see, okay, what is the associated investment risk actually for producing such a powertrain component? And what is the differentiation potential? Because many OEMs fall the trap that they want to produce this powertrain component just to keep the value share of the car. But can they really contribute to a differentiation of that specific component? And if we look at this matrix, obviously on the investment risk, and you have to see the upper right corner is obviously the best side you want to in. So you have investment risk for battery cells is obviously high if an OEM or a supplier asks he wants to produce battery cells. So that's why the cells are very much located on the lower left here. And also, what is your differentiation potential if you are, let's say, an OEM and want to produce your battery cells? It's probably very little. You haven't been in the game for battery cell manufacturing, automation of the processes for, let's say, cell manufacturing and then pack manufacturing for years. So you would be for a battery cell more on the lower left side. But what could be components that have a higher differentiation potential and maybe a lower investment risk? And that's where we see, for example, the E-engines, the electric engines, is from an investment point of view nothing compared to a battery manufacturing plant. It's from a differentiation point of view actually quite significant. First of all, I think even if the car is tomorrow not driven by a gasoline engine anymore, but an electric engine, still the customer associates like the driving performance with the electric engine, and many OEMs don't want to give that kind of core competence of that decides around the driving dynamic out of their competence. So electric engine is one of battery management system, BMS, definitely also very important. A lot of OEMs actually going into producing that in-house. It's very crucial for the lifetime of the battery, for the efficiency of the whole powertrain system, and thereby also influencing significantly the total cost of ownership of the electric car. On the right-hand side, you see some of those. What are the key trends of selected competitors? And this is from an OEM, also from a car company point of view. BMS. Most of the companies are actually doing this in-house. Electric engines, also many of them actually focusing to in-source that component. In some instances, they want to do a dual sourcing concept, so using a certain supplier for that, but also developing electric engines in-house. E-transmission, I think that follows in the industry a little bit the legacy that you have done. If an OEM used to produce transmission in a classical world, they most likely want to do that in an electric world as well. If they had them supplied from gate truck or ZF TRW, then they probably continue to do so also for the electric cars. On the battery pack side, this is something that OEMs don't want to give out of their competence, because in the end the battery has to fit with their vehicle architecture. And so you want to control the packaging, and also packaging and system integration. That's one of the core competences that OEMs want to continue to have in the electric world. And then performance electronics. I think there are two types of some of the let's say newer tech players. They are more on this side, on the insourcing side, and some of the let's say classical OEMs. They rather source this out to electronics players. And battery cells, as I just mentioned. I think here the game hasn't, or the dice haven't been really thrown, because there's still some volatility, and I think over the next couple of years we will still see some OEMs moving more aggressively into that field. The same we will also observe, I think, the one or the other tier one supplier engaging more actively in cell production of battery electric batteries. I mean, one thing that we have to remember, we are now in maybe in the second generation or third generation of lithium-ion batteries, and it's definitely the Asian players that have learned over the 3 generations to optimize the processes, and most of the cost advantages and cost benefits that we've seen so far is coming through optimization of the process, both on the upstream chemistry, like the cathode materials, but then also in the cell manufacturing and the packaging, really achieving high yield in the assembly and production process. And if you, as a tier one supplier of tomorrow, want to play in that field for a post-lithium generation battery, you need to have this process knowledge maybe today or in the next couple of years to be then competitive for the next generation of batteries. Maybe just one highlight for the engines. Engines, you can see actually OEMs have recognized that the electric engine is something they want to play with and they want to produce. Here the examples shown, they actually all doing in-house production of those electric engines for those cars that are shown here. On the supplier side, tier one supplier side, we see ZF, TRW, and Magna G-Truck kind of offering or aiming to offer the entire electric powertrain of tomorrow. I mean, you probably know ZF, TRW, they have already showcased, I think 2 years ago at the IAA in Frankfurt, a complete electric vehicle. And Magna is also, I think some of the trends are that these suppliers are aiming to produce a white label battery electric cars that could be supplied obviously for some of the new tech companies. I can jump over that one. So last point that I wanted to discuss on and close it is on electric mobility ecosystem and kind of the new business models that arise here. I think we mentioned already that in the classical world, innovation was driven by the, let's say, tier ones, tier twos, and also the OEMs. So it was really kind of a linear relationship in the value chain. A linear value chain, one-dimensional, but now actually with EVs coming into the market, that's a whole new ecosystem. You have electric cars, you have the utility players that provide the energy, you have some technical players that provide the charging infrastructure, you have the cities, the governments that kind of provide mobility, want to provide mobility solutions, and you have tech players who are going into that space who also want to get supplied from suppliers. So innovation is no longer created at the OEM level or at this tier one or tier two supplier level. It's created really at the interface of those different stakeholders of the industry. And if I could just a couple of examples, this is now, in the past it was like OEM and then you had the supply chain behind. Here's really the OEM is in the center, surrounded by the established suppliers. You have emerging OEMs, you have cities, transport, energy provider, tech giants, and mobility providers. So it's a new ecosystem where you really have new business models at the interface. So definitely from selling car to selling a mobility as a service, from an ownership-based to a usership-based mobility solution, that's something that comes directly to mind when you think about electric cars and how to offer them and how to bring them effectively to the market, e-hailing, etc. Then the second, white label BEV, I talked about that. That's tier one suppliers that are integrated in the e-powertrain architecture that produce electric cars for, let's say, new emerging OEMs, and they can produce the entire hardware, whereas the emerging OEM is more focusing on the software solution. E-contract, what I call it, it's something at the interface between energy providers and OEMs. So where you as an OEM, you want to offer not only the electric car, but an associated electricity contract with it that ensures your customer, he gets the best affordable, maybe industrial price rate electricity together with his electric car, and not only the electric price that he would get in his home plug. A home ecosystem, so where you supply your home with a charging unit, with a PV solar unit, and the electric car that interacts intelligently together. A smart utility, load balancing, obviously using the electric cars as part of the grid. The EV utility, a utility that sells then in the end electric cars. We see several utilities going to that direction in Europe, Asia, and also, I believe, in the US. And I just maybe highlight a few more which are interested in the interest of time. Definitely multimodal mobility, so urban cities, they want to have kind of offer a seamless mobility solutions to their end customers, including electric cars, electric buses, electric bikes, and other public transit solution. And also car share hubs, an interesting concept where actually the car share hubs are transit stations and also urban energy storage centers. So you see there's a lot of ideas, and that's just to name a few, how e-mobility business dynamics will evolve. And maybe to close, this discussion started with disruption, and disruption is happening both on a technological level, so autonomous, electric, whatever, and also on the business model level, so from ownership to usership, where we see today's our kind of revenue pools are really in the traditional business and technology. It will really unfold in all disruptions in businesses, technologies, and across the value chain depth from the mobility consumer out to the infrastructure player. And these will create new revenue pools, which in the end, the classical OEMs, tier one suppliers, and new players have to play and fight for. All right. With that being said, I think, Chloe, I'm at the end, right? Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please raise them now. We have, I think, 10 more minutes for questions. Okay, 3 or 4. All right. Any questions?
Anybody? I think I have a question. So, in one of your first slides, you showed the comparison between cell phone manufacturers and automotive OEMs. If you think about, it was only 10 years ago when the first iPhone was introduced, and now this crazy disruption has happened. Given that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 times longer to design vehicles, do you think disruption will happen 3 to 5 times longer in the automotive OEM space, or is there something about EVs that will accelerate that?
Let's see. If you look at the cell phone life cycle, probably 2 years, and the automotive life cycle 6-7 years, that you would think maybe it's 3 times as slow. But if you at the same time think that there are new business models that actually accelerate the lifetime of a car, shared vehicle lifetime is probably 2 years only compared to 6 years, then actually it can happen at the same pace. But it happens at different paces for different kind of end users. And so to your question, I think it will not be maybe as fast as the cell phone industry, but somewhere faster than normal, let's say, technological introductions in the automotive world.
Great. Anybody else? All right, I have one more then. So the automotive industry is often highlighted in like economic textbooks as the epitome of like a barrier to entry, particularly like the OEMs. Is there something about EV technology that you think makes it easier to enter as an automotive OEM? Do you think these new entrants, other than Tesla, will have an easier time than Tesla did?
So I think yes, definitely the complexity of the electric powertrain is less than for a combustion engine. There's 100 years of engineering that went into the development of the very efficient ICE engines of today. That's one factor. The other factor is also that the tier 1 suppliers have become much stronger and more integrated and are supplying almost like a driving chassis solutions that gives actually new players the chance to buy a complete hardware system and focus exclusively on the customer and software aspect on it, and thereby making it easier for them to enter. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Let's give him Patrick a round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you.